Ladies and gentlemen, welcome very much to the ISS for this discussion meeting in Butler on overcoming Pakistan's nuclear dangers. Pakistan's arsenal attracts interest for a variety of reasons. It's one of the fastest growing nuclear arsenals in the world. It's integral to the South Asian arms race. It's also at the heart of fears over nuclear theft and terrorism, and concerns also of the transfer of nuclear know-how and materials to other would-be nuclear powers. Overshadowing all these concerns, of course, is the risk of a nuclear war with India. Our author is the ISS Director for the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Programme, Mark Fitzpatrick. I would ask you all please to put your phones onto silent. Please feel free to tweet, but try not to intervene with phone ringing. And Mark.
Thank you, Nick. As noted in the introduction to my book, I undertook this project because I devoted most of my time here at IISS and before that in government to contemplating the dangers posed by Iran's nuclear program and the dangers posed by North Korea's nuclear weapons. But I was reminded by Gideon Rockman, sitting in the front row here in an FT column a year and a half ago, that it's actually Pakistan that has the world's fastest growing nuclear arsenal and the largest concentration of people bent on acts of terrorism who conceivably, if they got a hold of any of those weapons, would create catastrophe. I wanted to investigate Pakistan's nuclear dangers and what could be done about it. I devoted a chapter to each of the kinds of dangers that it presents. Now, especially given last week's nuclear security summit in Amsterdam, there's a proper focus on nuclear terrorism, and Pakistan naturally comes in for its share of attention. This is not without reason, given the number and brazenness of extremists in the country and the creeping fundamentalism that exacerbates concerns about insider collusion. The longest chapter in my book details the threat posed by terrorist groups and the times they are known to have expressed interest in nuclear weapons. When there are so many jihadists, the more weapons and fissile material that is produced, the more potential there is for theft, seizure, or sabotage, especially when materials are in transit. Nuclear terrorism in its usual sense means terrorist attacks on nuclear facilities or seizure of nuclear assets. The threat of nuclear terrorism in Pakistan in this sense is often exaggerated, though. 4 terrorist groups in Pakistan have reportedly expressed interest in nuclear weapons, but their inclinations in this regard are more opportunistic than systematic. 6 terrorist attacks have occurred at military facilities that reportedly house nuclear assets in Pakistan, but the attacks were not necessarily because of those assets, which were never in danger. A fundamentalist takeover of the country is highly unlikely, given the cohesion and discipline of the army and the esteem in which it is held. While the prospect for nuclear terrorism certainly cannot be dismissed, there is insufficient recognition of the steps Pakistan has taken to protect its nuclear program. The custodians of that program, the military's Strategic Plans Division, understand nuclear security. Their approach is not perfect. Security controls, such as permissive action links, can be circumvented, for example, if priority is given to launch reliability. And national paranoia about U.S. intentions undermines some of these efforts. For example, when nuclear weapons are moved more frequently as a precaution against a supposed American conspiracy to seize them. Yet it's fair to say that no country devotes more attention to nuclear security. A greater danger of Pakistan-related nuclear terrorism is in a wider sense, nuclear terrorism in a wider sense, is the potential for extremists sparking a nuclear war by conducting a spectacular terrorist attack in India. Suppressing groups that employ terrorism against India is one of the most important actions Pakistan could take to reduce nuclear dangers. When such concerns are raised, Pakistanis often point to counterclaims of Indian support for terrorist acts in Baluchistan and elsewhere. Regardless of the validity of such claims, a finger-pointing exercise a finger-pointing response misses the point. Terrorist attacks anywhere are reprehensible, particularly when they're directed against one country by groups with links to government elements of a second country. Large-scale terrorist attacks against India by Pakistan-based radicals are more invidious because they could spark a conflict leading to nuclear war. The danger of onward proliferation cannot be dismissed either. It's now been over 10 years, though, since A.Q. Khan and his associates transferred nuclear weapons technology to 3 and maybe 4 more countries, indelibly staining Pakistan's reputation. Pakistan's export controls continue to improve, though questions are still asked as to whether nuclear weapons might be transferred to Saudi Arabia as a matter of national policy. As I see it, the strategic, economic, and diplomatic disincentives for Pakistan make such a nuclear transfer unlikely. The potential for nuclear accidents in both the military and civilian realms poses another reason for concern. The nuclear weapons in South Asia are inherently less safe than those possessed by the 5 NPT-recognized nuclear weapon states because the ones in South Asia haven't been tested very often and not for safety. If deployed, there's a risk of accidental detonation, including if hit by enemy artillery. As the history of the U.S. atomic weapons program demonstrates, accidents can also happen for many other reasons. In the civilian sector, Pakistan pays serious attention to nuclear safety, but there are reasons for concern about the design and siting of its reactors. After considering all the dangers, I assess that the gravest nuclear dangers concerning Pakistan are the intensifying nuclear arms competition and the potential for use. As I said, Pakistan understands the terrorism problem and has taken steps to address nuclear security. But equivalent steps have not been taken to stop a budding nuclear and missile arms race. Officials in India and Pakistan rarely even admit to the problem. Now, in terms of numbers and the avoidance to date of hair-trigger alert status, the competition in South Asia pales in comparison to the U.S.-Russia or the former U.S.-Soviet rivalry. The competition in South Asia is less about numbers than about competing capabilities, both nuclear and dual use. The nuclear competition in South Asia is also largely unidirectional, as India seeks to catch up with China, and Pakistan tries to match India, albeit not in every respect. Today, Pakistan probably has about 120 nuclear weapons, India maybe about 10 less, but these are just notional numbers. Nobody outside the inner circle knows for sure. Pakistan is increasing its nuclear arsenal at a faster pace. By 2016, with the completion of 2 more plutonium production reactors, it may be able to produce about 16 bombs a year. By the mid-2020s, Pakistan could be the world's 5th or even 4th largest nuclear weapon state, ahead of both France and the United Kingdom. Yet India has far more potential for catching up, a situation that feeds Pakistan's worst-case assumptions. While Pakistan and India continue to advocate versions of minimum credible deterrence, the emphasis is on credibility rather than minimalism. One worrisome difference compared to the Cold War is the sense of nonchalance exhibited in South Asia about the dangers of nuclear war. Another reason for concern is the set of asymmetries that govern the 2 sides' nuclear doctrines. India forswears first use of nuclear weapons, but vows massive retaliation in response to a nuclear attack, even if against Indian forces operating outside national borders. Pakistan threatens to use battlefield nuclear weapons in response to conventional attacks that would not pose an existential threat to the state. The credibility of both doctrines can be questioned, but not dismissed or ignored. Constrained by limited uranium resources, Pakistan's arsenal will not grow inexorably. If the strategic environment is stable, senior Pakistani officials say production of plutonium could stop by 2020. By then, Pakistan might have 200 or so weapons. Meanwhile, Pakistan, like India, continues to expand its delivery systems. While India develops longer-range missiles, Pakistan's focus on short-range missile systems raises the most alarm. Pakistan describes the 60-kilometer Nasser and the 180-kilometer range Abdali as giving the state a tactical and theater level capability to supplement its strategic deterrence. Pakistan speaks of needing these tactical nuclear weapons to, quote, plug the deterrence gap, that is, to deny India the space for military operations below Pakistan's perceived nuclear threshold. The Nasser, in particular, is a response to the Indian Army's aspirational cold start plan to launch a conventional incursion to deter terrorist attacks emanating from Pakistan. The fact that India's civilian leadership has never endorsed cold start makes it no less threatening in Pakistani eyes. But realizing that tactical nuclear weapons cannot actually stop an enemy tank offensive, Pakistani military planners say their role is for deterrence, not for actual use in battle. The potentially destabilizing impact of a nuclear arms race in South Asia is exacerbated by Pakistan's introduction of these battlefield nuclear weapons. Due to the use them or lose them choice that could face local commanders, deployment of these systems can lead to rapid escalation if deterrence fails. Pakistan's need to portray credibility about firing first could sacrifice central government control over strategic weapons in a crisis situation, and pre-delegation could lead to unauthorized use. These are some of the reasons why NATO moved away from tactical nuclear weapons, which were found to be a costly encumbrance with little practical value. Pakistan insists that its short-range systems will not be pre-deployed, nor will use be delegated to field commanders, and that has to be applauded. But in the fog of a crisis, even the most robust of command and control systems cannot preclude human error. So there's good reason to worry that lowering of the nuclear threshold to include non-existential threats could lead to a devastating nuclear exchange. Since their independence in 1945, India and Pakistan have warred 3 times. In the last 28 years, they've nearly gone to war 5 other times, including the 2001-2002 crisis that prompted diplomats to evacuate. The presence of nuclear weapons contributed to calming these crises, but in an example of the stability-instability paradox, those weapons have also encouraged risk-taking. Abetted by accidents, misperceptions, or miscalculations, there remains a real possibility that another large-scale terrorist attack in India with Pakistani state fingerprints could trigger nuclear use. The development of cruise missiles, sea-based platforms, and other ambiguous dual-use systems heightens the potential for misperception. The underdeveloped mechanisms for crisis resolution in South Asia and the absence of dialogue on the factors behind nuclear risks are further reasons for concern. As usual, it's easier to describe the problems than to prescribe what can be done about it. My answer is that reducing the dangers associated with Pakistan's nuclear arsenal requires offering it a path to nuclear normalization if it adopts policies and practices associated with global nuclear norms. Pakistani officials naturally insist that their nation is a responsible nuclear weapons state. And I would agree that the nation's performance in many areas is certainly beyond reproach. Pakistan's stated policies of minimum deterrence and no pre-delegation of launch authority are certainly indicators of nuclear responsibility, as is its unofficial policy of keeping warheads and delivery systems demated and thus on a low level of alert status. Pakistan's proposals for a bilateral nuclear restraint regime with India are also positive. Pakistan understands the danger of nuclear terrorism and has done much of what it can to reduce vulnerabilities. Pakistan adheres to most international norms of nuclear safety. Pakistan is a member in good standing of the IAEA and has put all of its civilian nuclear facilities under safeguards. Pakistan has a robust export control system and a multi-tiered set of arrangements to ensure against repetition of onward proliferation by non-state actors. In other areas, however, Pakistan does not meet the norm. Now, depending on what indicators are deemed most relevant, the other nuclear armed states also fall short, it must be admitted. Pakistan bears a heavier burden of proof, however, because of its failure of nuclear stewardship regarding transfers by the AQ-Khan network, and because of the ongoing threats posed by other non-state actors in the nation. Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif exaggerated when he said at the Nuclear Security Summit that Pakistan has maintained a safe and secure nuclear program for several decades. It's that last three words that I think were exaggerated. Non-compliance with the global non-proliferation regime is the most obvious way in which Pakistan is outside the mainstream. As long as it retains nuclear weapons, Pakistan will never be a party to the NPT, which for a host of practical reasons cannot be amended. Contrary to my training and inclinations, I no longer think that NPT adherence is the only route in from the cold for Pakistan. It's an impossible condition given that Pakistan faces off against a nuclear-armed state that has been given de facto admission to the nuclear club. That exception for India came about for geostrategic reasons. Under President George W. Bush, the United States saw it as a means of bolstering India against China. Out of deference to political and diplomatic sensitivities, that rationale went largely unspoken. Instead, the exception was justified on grounds of India's proclaimed nuclear responsibility. Although India's non-proliferation record was not as perfect as claimed, it stood in sharp contrast to Pakistan's failure to stop Khan's nuclear sales. When the U.S.-India Nuclear Cooperation Agreement was first announced in July 2005, those proliferation transfers were a very recent memory, with Khan and his associates having been put out of business only the year before. 10 years later, though, it's fair to ask how long Pakistan must pay the price for that failure. U.S. policy once tilted toward Pakistan. After the Cold War, Washington sought to strike a balance between the two South Asian powers. Over the past decade, U.S. policy has shifted decidedly in favor of India. Meanwhile, Pakistan's estrangement from the West feeds the negative dynamic of growing fundamentalist tendencies in Pakistani society. I conclude that the time has come to offer Pakistan a nuclear cooperation deal akin to India's. Providing a formula for nuclear normalization is the most powerful tool that Western countries can wield in positively shaping Pakistan's nuclear posture. Offering nuclear legitimacy is also the most effective way to communicate that the United States and its allies do not seek to forcefully or stealthily disarm Pakistan, and that the Western goal, rather, is deterrence stability. Pakistan has already met most of the conditions required of India, including separating military and civilian facilities, putting all of the latter under safeguards, seeking to harmonize strategic trade controls with the export control regimes, and continuing a nuclear test moratorium. For India, the formula also included support for FMCT negotiations. At a bare minimum, Pakistan would have to end its veto over initiating FMCT talks in Geneva. Given that Pakistan has more to atone for and cannot match the strategic benefit that India's nuclear normalization seemed to offer, the quid pro quo would necessarily include some different terms. Pakistan should also be asked to end fissile material production, as each of the nuclear weapons states acknowledged by the NPT are thought to have done. It may be unrealistic to expect Pakistan today to stop plutonium production and separation, but by the time an FMCT is negotiated and ratified by other key states, Pakistan may already have enough plutonium to meet its military requirements. In the meantime, nuclear supplier group members should be wary of preferentially accepting India's application for membership. Doing so would likely drive Pakistan further away from the West and make it harder in the future to devise criteria that would enable Pakistani membership, over which India would then have a veto. In any case, NSG membership should be based on equitable criteria, not exceptions. Pakistan should also be asked to lock in its testing moratorium by signing and ratifying the CTBT. Although it's commonly assumed that domestic politics would not permit Pakistan to take any other arms control step in advance of India, there would be diplomatic benefits to getting the jump on New Delhi, especially if this were the price for admission into the international nuclear order. Meanwhile, India and Pakistan should find ways to engage one another on the issues that could spark a nuclear clash. Deterrence, stability, and the factors that contribute to growing nuclear risks should be central topics of dialogue covering both conventional and nuclear forces. Given the dynamics that could lead to nuclear use, walling off nuclear dialogue from discussions on conventional arms makes no sense. I conclude that alleviating the arms race is a worthy goal for the new governments that are soon likely to be in place in both countries. And I thank you for your attention, except for that one bird call, and welcome your comments and questions.
Mark, thank you. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions. We have a microphone in place. First person to catch my eye is you, sir, at the front. If you could please wait for the microphone and then state your name. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And please accept my congratulations on your second Adelphi on matters related to Pakistan. And a major takeaway is that, to a great extent, it's a value-neutral work that can be emulated by other scholars in South Asia. I have several comments, but I'll restrict to only few, most important ones. Now, the growing recognition that Pakistan is a responsible nuclear weapon state has come after years, if not decades, of proactive engagement with non-proliferation regime, although we do not accept NPT in its current form. And offering a civil nuclear cooperation deal and legitimacy to Pakistan would not only stabilize South Asia, but it shall also normalize discrimination in the non-proliferation regime. As you said, participation in the NSG should be on equitable terms and not on the basis of exceptional criteria. And that's why the preconditions of FMCT and signing and ratifying comprehensive test ban treaty are a tough sell. And our position is quite clear on both the issues. As far as CTBT is, Pakistan was not the first one to test weapons in South Asia, and it will not resume testing. And on FMCT, we have security concerns, and the idea of cutting off future production would probably freeze the status quo. And Pakistan was a reluctant entrant into the nuclear weapons game and has legitimate security concerns that have not been addressed. And a few words about the second issue that I want to mention. Yeah, I'll be brief, and which is the fastest growing arsenal. Now, it is a debatable and a subjective term, and I know that it's not of your making. Someone else coined this term. Interestingly, the numerical difference between the states that have stopped producing more arsenal and the states that are producing arsenal is much larger. And in this linear race, the bigger question is that where would India stop? If it is in competition with another state, where would it stop? Thank you.
Thank you. Could I just ask you to identify yourself for the audience?
I'm Zahir Kazmi, and I'm a fellow here at IISS.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zahir, for those well-considered comments. Zahir had the advantage of reading the book a couple days ago. I know that the conditions I suggested for a nuclear cooperation deal are a tough sell in Pakistan. But let me tell you, they're a really tough sell in Washington. I was in Washington last week and met with people who think a lot about this subject, and many of them thought that I was too lenient. And I met with people in a government that also thought that the conditions would have to be tougher, like getting rid of the battlefield nuclear use weapons. So I think you should take my deal. And because precisely what you said, that cutting off fissile material production would freeze the status quo, I think Pakistan would be better off freezing the status quo. I know that in Pakistan they don't think this because they think that India is far ahead. But in terms of India's vast potential for expansion, if both India and Pakistan could be frozen where they are today, I think Pakistan would be better off. I know that's debatable and subjective. I don't think it's subjective and debatable to say that Pakistan has the world's fastest growing arsenal. Now, it's debatable, I suppose, in the sense that nobody knows for sure how many nuclear weapons Pakistan produces every year. It's an estimate based on fissile material production, which can be estimated based on the size of the plutonium production reactors and the size of the HEU. And the main comparison, of course, is India, because the 5 acknowledged nuclear weapon states have all stopped fissile material production, and it's assumed that Israel has also got what it needs. So the question is India producing more fissile material for weapons purposes than Pakistan? My assessment is no, that most of the fissile material India produces for highly enriched uranium is for purposes of propulsion of its nuclear-powered vessels. But I guess that's also subjective. I get your point.
Gideon Rackman, please.
Thank you for the thanks. I was delighted to know that I gave you the idea for a book. So I have many questions, but I'll just try a couple of them on you. One, I was very interested by your idea, the rather alarming idea, that the next time there was a terrorist attack, a large sort of Mumbai-style terrorist attack in India, if it were linked to Pakistan, plausibly, that could then trigger this war that leads to nuclear war. And I wondered whether you thought that Indian restraint last time had more to do with the personality of Manmohan Singh, and therefore if you have a Narendra Modi as Prime Minister of India, that's basically a riskier situation, or whether actually, regardless of who was Prime Minister, some kind of nuclear deterrence would work, that people would take a deep breath and think, well, actually, we don't want to get into that situation. And this is the second question, is possibly more from the kind of realm of fiction than fact, but I've always been intrigued by what you describe as this Pakistani nightmare that the Americans have at the back of their mind, an idea that in extremis they might try to gain control of Pakistani nuclear weapons. I mean, given their number and their dispersal, is that completely out of the question? Would that be impossible if they had to do it?
Thank you, Gideon. And again, thank you for inspiring me. I don't think that it's so much a matter of personality of the Indian leader as to whether they would respond in force the next time. In talking with strategy experts in New Delhi, I got the sense that there's a pretty strong belief across the board that India has turned the other cheek too many times, and that the next time they need to respond in order to restore deterrence. So no matter who the government is, I think that will be an impulse. Now, how they respond is a big question. And here, your point about does nuclear deterrence work might actually have been a factor in dissuading, India from sending 8 to 10 integrated battle groups across the border into 50 miles into Pakistan, as outlined in the so-called Cold Start plan. That plan has never been endorsed by the political leadership of India, and I think it's more likely that India would do something else, say pinprick attacks against the camps of whatever terrorist groups are implicated in an attack. But who knows exactly? India has many options. The question about the Pakistan's nightmare about U.S. Black Hawks swooping in and grabbing all the nuclear weapons is a total fantasy. You know, as you said, they're stored in 10 to 15 places. Nobody knows exactly where they are. They're moved around from time to time. They're very heavily defended by layers and layers of different security forces. It's nothing like the Osama bin Laden raid, where there was one target, one individual, not at all protected by any security forces at all. Now, the U.S. military, I assume, has plans to try to seize nuclear weapons anywhere in the world that fall into the hands of terrorists. And so naturally they would have a plan if that were to happen in Pakistan. But they're talking about a singular incident of a nuclear weapon or a cache of nuclear weapons falling into terrorist hands. It's not a plan to go in and seize all of Pakistan's nuclear weapons.
Thank you. Next two questions are over on this side of the room. First, you, sir, please. Just wait for the microphone.
Hi, Mark. Thanks. It's Hugh Chalmers from RUSI. Thanks for a really interesting, very frank talk. The idea of a nuclear suppliers group exemption in return for CTBT and FMCT certainly seems like a really kind of appealing prospect. It's quite a neat little deal, but as everybody said, it's going to be a very difficult one to strike. But I was wondering whether or not you could expand upon how integrating Pakistan as this nuclear mainstream by getting it to, giving it a nuclear suppliers group exemption, making sure that it's up to date, as it were, with as many non-proliferation treaties as possible, if not, the NPT. How would that actually reduce the risk of nuclear war between India and Pakistan? It would certainly improve relations with the US. It may expose Pakistan to more kind of conventional thinking in terms of nuclear war, but how would that actually result in a reduction in the risk of nuclear war?
Right. So I go through the different ways that it would be great if Pakistan would join the nuclear mainstream, including by stopping production of fissile material. If fissile material is no longer produced, Pakistan won't be expanding its battlefield-use nuclear weapons, and there's more likelihood that eventually they will move away from that doctrine as NATO moved away from it. It's the battlefield-used nuclear weapons that cause the greatest concern, of course, and it's why in Washington it was suggested to me that really ought to be the top condition. I didn't include it in my book because I don't think it's realistic in the foreseeable future. But if they stop fissile material production, I think that is foreseeable, because I was told in Pakistan that by 2020 they could stop. That's not too far off in the distance.
Okay, Lucy, down the front, please.
Hi, Mark. This is Aftab Siddiqui. I'm just a student of development in Southeast Asia. The question I have is in terms of, we're discussing the armament race and the nuclear armament race in Southeast Asia, and specifically within South Asia with Pakistan and India perspective. Now, this could be a symptom, and the problem lies in what is termed as borderline madness, where the line of control between India and Pakistan is still not been considered as an international border that both countries can sort of, realize and adhere to. And in your discussions within policymaking lobbies in Washington and India, do you see there's a sense to look at the basic problem and try to sort of put some energies and sort of resources to solve that issue, which if done may stop India and Pakistan sort of interfering in each other's domestic issues? Quetta issues could be stopped, Kashmir issues could be stopped basically, LAT's incursion in Bombay could not happen again. So what's your sense on that basic problem, basically? If you're not able to resolve that, I think whatever discussions can take place, I think it would never stop, basically, because both the countries think that it's in their interest to sort of have a mutual destructive kind of arrangement available, so that nobody does anything basically on a large scale. So your comments on that. Thank you very much.
Washington and London would like nothing better than for the territorial issues to be resolved and to remove what is, of course, behind all of the conflicts between India and Pakistan. But they understand that it's not going to be feasible for them to come up with a solution that's not something that's acceptable to both India and Pakistan. And as you know, there's no appetite in South Asia for big powers to come in and dictate terms, or even to be an intermediary, or even to say that these issues are unresolved. The United States, I know from my own diplomatic background, has thought about that. You know, it's the first thing we all think about, obviously, but that's, I'm afraid, not the most feasible path forward to resolving these dangers.
Okay, next question, gentleman in the middle, please.
Mark Kanazulfikar, Pakistan High Commission. Just two small questions. First is regarding, you yourself admitted that there appears to be a discriminatory attitude from the West when it comes to India-Pakistan. So on that issue, there's a lot of attention on the tactical nuclear weapons Nasr by Pakistan. But India at the same time has also developed short-range Prahar and Pravati, who can, as they themselves admit, they haven't said it can carry nuclear warheads, but they said it can carry many warheads. So we can safely assume that for India to develop such weapons should not be a problem. So the issue of tactical nuclear weapons is also obviously is a two-sided issue. And second is regarding there appears to be a general acceptance of the right for the Indians to respond militarily to a terrorist incident inside India, which may or may not have Pakistani state sponsorship, because these things are extremely difficult to prove. And in the current environment of the way things are happening, the very wide terrorist threat, these are extremely difficult to prove. So I think it is a policy on the part of the West to actually give this kind of an acceptance that we accept that anything happens in India, they should be able to go across the border into Pakistan or carry out. So there's an acceptance. But at the same time, there is absolute abhorrence of Pakistan response to that kind of a thing, which is, Nasr is part of that response. So I think there's again still some discrimination. Maybe in your next book, you can offer this as well. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Colonel Zulfikar. The discriminating attitude that I mentioned is not totally without merit because of the failures of nuclear stewardship. But I recognize the problems emanating from the discrimination. The Prahar, okay, does India have a tactical nuclear weapon concept? No. Does it have short-range nuclear armed missiles? No. The Prahar is a short-range missile, and as you said, it is described as having multiple warheads, diverse warheads or something, and when it was marketed in Seoul, it was said to have a counterforce potential, a counterforce purpose, which counterforce, usually is seen to mean nuclear warhead. I don't know if DRDO meant that when they said it. I think they must have been chastised when they came back to New Delhi for suggesting it. But I just don't think that India today has tactical nuclear weapons. It's not part of their nuclear policy. They haven't tested nuclear weapons. They're small enough for it. None of their warheads could fit the Prahar. So although it's presumed that they certainly could develop it, it's not their plan today. You're right, of course, that state sponsorship of terrorist acts is extremely difficult to prove. And I don't mean to give acceptance to Indian incursion into Pakistan territory based on unconfirmed accusations. But I think there's probably a disinclination in Pakistan, understandably so, to not recognize state fingerprints that are recognizable to most other observers. And in the case of Mumbai, one of the people arrested in the case testified in a U.S. court about state connections. Now, it doesn't mean that the state directed terrorist attacks, funded them, but it means that there was some state connection, maybe sometime in the past. And that's what I mean by fingerprints. And that's the danger, I think. And that's why I said that the best step that Pakistan could take would be to suppress groups that employ terrorist tactics against India. And I recognize how difficult that is.
Yes, please.
My name is Shamsul Arifin, I'm a member of IISS. My question is, the main reason of conflict between India and Pakistan is the issue of Kashmir. Both countries went on a war on this issue several times previously. So should it not be in the interest of West to use their influence to bring both parties to the table to resolve that issue in order to minimize the risk of a nuclear conflict?
With your permission, I'll take that as a comment and advice. The answer I gave to the gentleman in front is the same answer I would give, that unless India is also willing to accept that advice, it doesn't serve much purpose for the United States to be trying to intercede in a dispute that it is not welcomed as a mediator.
Well, let me ask one, Mark. The proposal that you're making is quite a radical one in terms of the overall non-proliferation regime. I was wondering if it were to be taken up, what is the broader impact on non-proliferation generally? Are the new vistas that open up? Are there particular problems that open up?
Yeah, there are a lot of problems that open up, and I make this recommendation not with enthusiasm. It reminds me of, back when I was in grad school, I learned this concept of 51-49. If you marshal all the arguments about a policy and it comes out 51% in support of the policy, you ought to support the policy, recognizing that there are downsides, 49% even. And among the downsides of recognizing Pakistan's nuclear weapons, giving it legitimacy, are that Israel will be right next in line to seek the same deal. And any criteria that Pakistan would meet, I'm sure Israel would meet. And Israelis have already been asking for that same deal that India got of nuclear cooperation and exemption from the NSG guidelines. But then that opens up another can of worms in the Middle East. If Israel is given preferential treatment in the Middle East, it doesn't contribute to reducing the nuclear dangers in the Middle East. I think it would exacerbate the potential for other states in the Middle East to feel discriminated against and maybe seek their own options. I don't go into the downsides in the book. You know, Adelphi books have a certain word limit, and you make a case and push for it, and that's what I did. But I'm happy to talk about that. I'm glad you raised the point.
I'm glad you raised the Adelphi books have word limits, and I will be enforcing that message to our colleagues. Jane Sharp, please.
Thank you. I've been toying about whether to ask this question, but since you've mentioned Israel, we're moving geographically over there. I'm just trying to imagine how I would feel if I was sitting in Tehran now, assessing Western attitudes to their nuclear program. You know, in the sense that the West has obviously accepted that India and Pakistan are nuclear powers, however we define it. You know, why are we so exercised about the very small possibility that Iran is making nuclear weapons, based on your thinking about Pakistan?
Sure. I think there's good reason to be exercised about the possibility that Iran is developing the plans to make nuclear weapons. I would agree that Iran is probably not making nuclear weapons today, but they're certainly getting ready to do so should the fatwa against nuclear weapons change. They want to be able to build them as fast as possible. I think that's a nuclear hedging strategy that seems pretty clear. And I think there are good reasons why that would be detrimental to regional security and to the security of most of the nations represented in this room. And the case of Pakistan shows why it's so detrimental. You know, we would be much better off if India and Pakistan did not have nuclear weapons. The potential for those weapons falling into terrorist hands wouldn't exist if the weapons didn't exist. I don't think that Iran, if they acquired nuclear weapons, would give nuclear weapons to terrorist groups. That would be suicidal. What country would willingly give up its most valued assets? But Pakistan allowed Abdul Qadir Khan to share nuclear secrets and nuclear weapons technology with at least 3 other states. So it's easy for me to hypothesize that an Iranian Abdul Qadir Khan in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is known to be corrupt, which has links with groups that employ terrorist tactics, such a man might be willing, as was Abdul Qadir, to share nuclear technology and maybe nuclear weapons plans, as Khan did with Libya, and maybe nuclear material. There's the prospect for use of nuclear weapons, and well, I don't have to tell you this. You're more of an expert on nuclear use than I am, but you know, accidents and misperceptions and all that. The dangers that I described for India, Pakistan, of an escalatory scenario, I think would play in some similar ways, different, but some similar ways in the Middle East. The potential for nuclear possession abetting risky behavior is another reason. In South Asia, the presence of nuclear weapons, it's pretty clear, gave Pakistan military commanders reason to think that behavior that, risky behavior like crossing the line of control in upper Kashmir in 1998, they would be protected by having nuclear weapons. And already Iran employs risky behavior in a lot of places, including their support fighters on the ground in Syria, and so that could be exacerbated. I could go on, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. Gentleman at the back, please.
Mike Wooldridge from BBC. I was wondering how you read the attitude of all of the main parties in Pakistan, excuse me, not just the PMLN, but also PPP and Imran Khan's and so on, at the moment towards what the country's nuclear ambition should be, how they see nuclear weapons, what kind of greater controls and constraints they would accept if such a deal as you're describing were to be possible. How much of a consensus is there? What important differences might there be?
I'm not able to differentiate among parties, but I think I can say pretty clearly that throughout Pakistani society, there's very strong support for the nuclear weapons program. They see it as a technological achievement. They don't begrudge the costs of the program. And there's very little debate within Pakistan about the program itself or about the ways it is expanding. The debate that Europeans have about the dangers of nuclear weapons, you don't have that debate at all. There might be a handful of people in Pakistan who talk about it. Pervez Hoodbhoy wrote a book last year describing the dangers, and he doesn't have too many fans in Pakistan, to put it mildly. So would there be support among the political parties for the deal I outlined? I think it comes down to whether the military would support it. And if the military thought it was in Pakistan's national interests, I don't think it would be a matter of political parties saying no to it. The military runs the nuclear strategy and makes these decisions.
Thank you. Kieran Malik, please.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Mark, for a fantastic contribution to the area, which is unfortunately has, as you said, gone for a lot of conflicts in the past. My question is, composite dialogue between India and Pakistan has taken is at a deadlock right at the moment. Do you think that if the nuclear issue is not really prioritized that much in the relations between India and Pakistan at the moment, and other parts of the composite dialogue are perhaps there is more effort towards having normalization between the composite dialogue between India and Pakistan. You see better in the future if there are any successes in that particular parts of the composite dialogue. Do you see success for both the countries to actually table this issue later on? Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, I think the issue of dialogue and normalization are important issues. Let me first talk about the normalization. Maybe one of the best ways to reduce the tensions is for increased trade. And I just couldn't figure out why it took Pakistan so long to implement the agreement of 3 years ago for most favored nation status for India. Although it was explained to me in my last trip to Pakistan that in Urdu, most favored nation for India means we love India the most, and that has a negative connotation. But I think it's moving ahead, because the business communities basically understand the benefits of it. The composite dialogue is great if it only could keep going without all these interruptions. But as I said in the book, the dialogue, I think, has to include a discussion of the triggers for a potential nuclear exchange, the motivations. And that means talking about both subconventional, that is terrorist attacks, and conventional responses, and nuclear responses to the conventional responses. So I think there has to be the whole panoply of issues that cause the risks needs to be discussed. Now, Pakistan, for its part, has suggested things like this, strategic restraint dialogue. India has not been welcome to that. I think this is, as I said, one of the areas where Pakistan gets a plus.
Well, if there are no more questions, Nomi, sorry.
Nomi Bar-Yakov, Chatham House, former IISS. Mark, thank you very much for an absolutely brilliant presentation. You mentioned sort of kind of unequivocally that the military makes all the decisions on the nuclear issue in Pakistan, but would you see any point in reaching out to opinion shapers, to the sort of people who, like Gideon Rahman, but not just the equivalent of the FT, also the popular talk shows, and raising public awareness about A, the dangers of the program, and B, and more importantly, how to overcome them in the interest of Pakistan's national security? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nomi. That's a good point. That's why I want everybody in Pakistan to buy my book, and I will be going to Pakistan in May, and I'm hoping to do exactly that, to talk with academics and opinion shapers. But the most important opinion shapers are in the military, and how to talk to Pakistanis in general about an issue that they feel pretty passionately about. I struggled with this, and I explained in the introduction how most of the time when Westerners talk about nuclear dangers in Pakistan, it just makes Pakistanis get their backs up and, who are you to tell us about nuclear dangers when you have 10,000 nuclear weapons and you've had all these safety incidents and so forth. And the more U.S. government officials or British government officials talk about it publicly, the more it kind of exacerbates this sense of paranoia that our purpose is just non-proliferation. It's to go in and get rid of the nuclear weapons. And I thought maybe the best way to deal with this would be to try to say in my book why Pakistan feels the need for these weapons, and to quote officials at length to the extent that they let me quote them, if not name otherwise. And I'm actually pretty happy with the reception I'm getting so far in Pakistan. Zahir's comment that it was fair, I take that as a huge compliment.
Final question, very brief, please.
Thank you, sir. I'm Air Commodore Bedi from Indian High Commission. I just take a lead from what you just said, that why does a country need nuclear weapon? Now, I would want your comment, sir, that on greater Western nations or greater responsibilities as to how do they behave universally for nations to decide whether they need nuclear weapons or not. What I'm hinting at is that their behavior with respect to nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots sometimes clearly demonstrates that some nations would have been better off with nuclear weapons. I mean, certain interventions, let's say you take Libya or potential intervention in Syria, would the attitude have been same if these countries possessed nuclear weapons. So don't you think that great powers also have responsibility to demonstrate to the world that, look, it's not a very good idea to have nuclear weapons and we treat everybody equally? Thank you very much.
Well, I'm glad you ended where you did on the theme that it's better for nobody to have nuclear weapons than for everybody to have them. I mean, Lord help us if Syria had nuclear weapons today, or if Gaddafi had them. It was a real tribute to British and American diplomacy that Gaddafi does not have nuclear weapons, and I'm thankful to Israel that Syria doesn't have them. I take your larger point. There is more that the nuclear armed states can do to reduce the salience of nuclear weapons. That was Obama's theme in his Prague speech 5 years ago. It hasn't panned out as much as he wants. Circumstances in Crimea make it even more difficult to get Russian buy-in to further reductions. But there are different ways that I think Obama and the British government are committed to it. They're probably not working as fast toward that goal as you might hope.
Thank you. I'll bring it to a close there. If you're an ISS member, you will already have received your copy. If you would like to buy another, it is available, and perhaps do so before Mark persuades the entire population of Pakistan to buy out the print. It's also available on Kindle if you'd like. Two dates for your diary quickly while I still have your attention. New Climate Science Implications for Security. That's Monday, 7th of April, starting at 1:30 here. And then Wednesday, 9th of April, 12 o'clock on the nose, Pope Francis between Obama and Putin with Massimo Franco, who, if you were watching Panorama last night, was the anchoring commentator on that program. All remains is to ask you to join me in thanking Mark.